Hello, and welcome to this video on setting up Duende IdentityServer to use Entity Framework and ASP.Identity. In a previous video, we showed how to set up IdentityServer, but we used in-memory stores, and we use those in-memory stores for all the resources that IdentityServer needed and for things like clients. We really need our data to be persisted. So in this talk, we'll see how to use Entity Framework for that data. And we also need a way to manage users. And for that, we'll see how to use ASP.Identity within Duende Identity Framework. Okay, let's go and write some code. So in a previous video, we showed how to set up Duende IdentityServer, but we used in-memory stores. So we had things like in-memory API resources, and we had in-memory users. In this video, we'll remove all those stores, and instead we'll use a database. So we'll see how to use Duende's Entity Framework support, and we'll also see how we can add users into that database. And for that, we'll see how to use Duende's ASP.NET Core.Identity support. So we'll do this in a few steps. And the first thing we'll do is keep the in-memory users, but move everything else to the database. And for that, I need to add some packages. So in my project, if I go into NuGet, the first thing I'm going to add is a Duende package, which will be Identity Server, and it'll be Identity Server Entity Framework. And that's here. And we'll add that into our Identity Server project. We then need to add a couple of Microsoft packages. So I'm going to add Microsoft. And the first one I'm going to add will be the ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core package. And again, into our Identity Server project. We then need the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Diagnostics Entity Framework Core package. Again, we'll add that into Identity Server. We need the Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools package. And for our database, we're going to use SQLite. So we need the Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite package. Now, obviously, you can use any database that's supported by Entity Framework for this. We're using SQLite just because it makes it very easy to set up and tear down these databases and to share the databases and the code. So for our database, we need a connection string. So if I go into App Settings, in here, we'll create a new section called Connection Strings. We'll have a default connection, and this will be our SQLite connection string. And for that, we're going to say data source equals, and we'll just create a database called IdentityServer.db. So before we add the database support, we need to remove all the in-memory code. So if I go into program.cs, I'm going to leave my add test users in place for now, but we'll remove that later in this video. But I'm going to remove all of these add in-memory calls, as we don't need those anymore. Instead, we need to configure some database stores that Entity Framework can use. Now, Entity Framework requires two stores. It requires what's known as the configuration store and the operational store. And we have some functions to help us add those. So I want to say add configuration store. And add configuration store takes a lambda that allows us to configure the store. This lambda is passed in options. And we'll use this to configure a couple of things. We need to configure the store's DB context. So for that, we want to say options.configure DB context. And again, that's a lambda, but this is a single line lambda. And this lambda takes a DB context option builder. So we can say something like DB goes to DB dot, and we're going to tell this which database to use. So we're going to say use SQLite. Now, when we do this, we also have to configure SQLite. Now, to configure SQLite, we need two things. We need the connection string we just set up, and we're also going to generate migrations. So we need to know which assembly those migrations live in, i.e. this assembly. So at the top of the code here, I'm going to add two constants. I'm going to create a connection string constant, and we get our connection string from the configuration. So I can say builder.configuration, and then from the configuration, I can call getConnectionString. And we just pass it the name of our connection string, which is the default connection, if I can spell it correctly. We also need to get a reference to this assembly, the one we're currently running inside, and we use that to manage our migrations. So again, I'll create a constant here, and I'll call this migrations assembly. And to get that, we need to get a reference to one of the types used in this application. And then from that, we can get the assembly, and then we can get the name of the assembly. So we say something like type of, I have a class called config. From there, I can get the assembly that class is in. From that, I can get the name of the assembly. And then we want the name property from that value. So now I can use these two values in the call to use SQLite. The first thing I pass to this is the connection string. And the second thing I pass to this is a lambda. And again, that lambda takes an options. And inside this lambda, we can configure the migrations. So in here, we can say something like opt.migrationsassembly. And we just pass this the name of the assembly that we extracted above. So as well as calling .addConfigurationStore, I also want to call addOperationalStore. And the code for this is exactly the same. So we call configure_dbContext, which takes a lambda. Inside that lambda, we call useSQLite. And inside there, we pass in the connection string and we set up our migrations assembly, which will be the same assembly. So now that we have that, we can create and run these migrations. So we have two stores, so we have to run two sets of migrations. So the first one is against this configuration DB context for this configuration store. And we know now how to run these migrations. We run .NET EF migrations add, and we pass it the name of the migration. So we run the first one, and that creates the migrations for me. For the second one, the DB context is called the persisted grant DB context. So we can run the migrations for that. Once I run this, if I go back into the project, we now have this migrations directory. And inside here, we have these two sets of migrations. We have one for the configuration DB context and one for the persisted grant DB context. Once we've added the migrations, we can now apply these migrations to the store. And it doesn't really matter the order in which we apply these, but we need to apply them both. So for this, we call .NET EF database update, passing it the DB context. So for the first one, we pass the configuration DB context, and that will update the database for me. And for the second one, we pass the persisted grant DB context. And again, it will update the database for me. Now, if we go back into Rider, we'll find we have a database. This IdentityServer.db is a SQLite database. Rider has a database tool. If I take this DB file and drag it into this database window and say OK to connect to the database, then inside here, we can see the tables that have been added. So these are the Duende Identity Server tables that we need. So we have things like API resources, we have things like API scopes, we have things like client claims, so all the tables that are used by this application. So how do we use those tables? So the first thing I want to do is to seed those tables with data. Now Duende provide a set of templates that provide starting points for Identity Server development. And one of those templates is an entity framework-based template. And if I create a project using that template, it provides some code to seed the database for me. And I've taken that code and I've added it to this project. And we have this file here called seeddata.cs. Now notice, at the moment, this doesn't compile. And it doesn't compile because it makes use of Serilog. So let's go and add Serilog into our project and see how we can set that up. So again, from NuGet, I'm going to search for Serilog, but I want to search for Serilog ASP.NET Core and add that into the Identity Server project. Now, once we have that, our compile errors go away. But we also need to configure Serilog so we can use it within the project. So back inside program.cs, there are a couple of things I want to do here. And I'm not going to go through these in detail. So the first thing I want to do is to configure Serilog. And to do that, we call builder.host.use Serilog. And here we configure Serilog. We set things at the minimum level. We override some of the built-in logging. And we describe a template for our output logs. And notice here, we're only writing out to the console. I'm also going to use Serilog to log out that our application has started up. And I can add that call to the top of the application and just write out a message that says starting. And that's it for Serilog. So now what I'd like to do is to add an option to our application so that when it starts up, it will see the database, i.e. I want to add a command line flag to the application. And that command line flag will be /seed. So if we are past that command line flag, then I want to see the database. If we are not past that command line flag, then I want to run as normal. So here, at the end of my code, I want to say something like this. I want to say something like if args.contains, and we're going to use the argument /seed. I want to log out that we're about to see the database. And then in between these two calls, I want to run the seed code. So my seed data class is a static class, and then has a method called ensure seed data. And to this, I just need to pass the application object. If we're not seeding the database, then we run the application as normal. So to seed the database, I need to run the application, passing along the /seed command line argument. And we can do that from our command prompt. So I say .NET run, the name of the project is Identity Server, and the command line is /seed. If I do that, it will build the application for me and then seed the database. So if I go back into Rider, and from within Rider's database window, create a new query console, then from here, if I do something like select star from API resources, let's say, we can see now we've seeded the database with our data. So we have our weather API resource set up. So that's the first part done. So for the second part, we're going to add ASP.NET Core Identity into Identity Server. So again, the first thing we need to do is to add a NuGet package. And the package we're going to add this time is Duende IdentityServer.ASP.NET Identity. So we can add that. And as before, we have to configure the database. So before the call to add Identity Server, I need to add another DB context. And this will be the DB context to support our users. Now for this, I'm going to create my own DB context. And I'm doing that just so that it gives us a little bit more flexibility. So in my project here, I'm going to add a directory that I'll call database. And into here, I'm going to add a class called application DB context. Now this class will derive from a base class called identity DB context. And we need to configure this. So first of all, my application DB context will take a reference to a DB context options. And that DB context options takes a type parameter, which is our application DB context. And we'll call this DB context options. And we pass that onto the base class. And this is the DB context we're going to use to configure our identity. So back inside program.cs, I'm going to say builder.services.add DB context. And the DB context we're going to add is our application DB context. And again, we need to configure this. And again, we need to tell it to use SQLite and to configure the migrations. So we say options goes to. Inside here, we say options.use SQLite. And again, to SQLite, we're going to configure the migrations. And that code is the same as the code we use for the other two stores. So with the DB context in place, we now have to add identity. So again, before we call add identity server, we say builder.services.add identity. And to the add identity, we have to pass two things. We have to pass the C# type of the user that identity will use and the role type that identity will use. And for this, we're going to use the built-in types. So we're going to say identity user and identity role. And then on to add identity, we have to tell it which DB context to use. So for that, we call add entity framework stores. And to add entity framework stores, we pass application DB context. And then we need to do one more thing. We get rid of this call now to add test users. And instead, we replace it with a call to add ASP.NET identity. And again to this, we specify the type of the identity that's being used, and that would be our identity user type. Now, given that, we need to add some users to our stores. And in my seed data class, there's a function called ensure users. And this adds two users into our database. One with the username of Alice, one with the username of Bob. But if you saw the previous talk, In that talk, the passwords were Alice and Bob, but now we've had to change those passwords to match the rules defined by ASP.NET Core Identity. And both passwords are now pass123$. So back at the top here, as well as calling ensure seed data, we need to call ensure users. And to this, we pass in this scope object. So with that in place, we can now create the migrations and add them to the database. So back at the command prompt, we can add the migrations, this time for the application DB context. And then we can apply those migrations to the database. And if I go back into Rider and look at the database, we can now see there are some ASP.NET tables in there. So things like ASP.NET users and ASP.NET roles. So we've added the ASP.NET identity tables into this database. So now that we've done that, if I go back to the command prompt and run the seed code again, our users have been added to the database. And we can see at the end here, the messages Alice created and Bob created. So there's still one other thing that we have to do. At the moment, we are using the Duende Quick Start UI to allow our users to register and to allow our users to log on. And that relies on the test users. So we need to update that to use ASP.NET Core Identity. So the first place to go is if I look in the Pages directory, inside the Account folder, Login, and then the code behind for index.cs.html. And notice here, it makes use of this test user store. So I'm going to delete that. I'm also going to delete the parameter that's passed into the constructor. And finally, here, where we initialize the users, we'll delete that as well. Instead, I'm going to use ASP.NET Core Identity. And that has something called a sign-in manager. So as a parameter to this constructor, I'm going to pass the sign-in manager. And the type of that is our user type, which is identity user. And we'll just call this sign-in manager and then assign it to this read-only field underscore sign-in manager. Then in the onPost action here for login, we'll find we have some errors. So this was using our test user store to validate the user. Instead now, we need to use the sign-in manager. So for that, the first thing we need to do is to grab the user based on the username. And in this case, we're going to grab the user from the database. So I want to say something like var user equals await. This is an async call. We'll use the sign-in manager. That has a thing called the user manager. And then from the user manager, we can call find by name async. And we have to pass this, the user's name. And that is part of the input and is input.username. I can then replace this call to validate credentials to a call which says something like if user is not equal to null and I want to check the password. And again, to do that, we're going to use the sign-in manager. And we've got to make a call called check password sign-in async. So I want to await on that call. And then to check password sign-in async, we pass the user we created above. We pass the user's password, which is in input.password. And then we pass this flag for lockout on failure. And we'll just pass false for that. And then we want to check the sign-in result for this. And we want to check that that sign-in result is success. And we want to use the ASP.NET Core Identity sign-in result. I now no longer need to get the user here, as I have the user from above. And then notice we get some compile errors. And these are just naming issues. So we set username to be case sensitive. Subject ID becomes ID. Same here. Subject ID becomes ID. And username becomes username in the uppercase N. So that's our index.cs.html page done. Now there's one other place we need to change that. And that's in the external login pages. This is used if we have an external login, such as Google, for example. Now again in here, notice we have our test user stores again, so I can get rid of that and this assignment. Now into the constructor this time, we're going to inject the user manager directly. So we say user manager, and again that's of type identity user, and again we'll assign this to a underscore user manager field. Down here inside the onGet, where we call _users by find external provider, we are now going to use our user manager. So we're going to await on _user manager dot find by login async. And that takes the same two parameters, so a provider and a provider user ID. Now, if that user doesn't yet exist in our database, rather than calling auto provision user, instead, we're going to create a user and insert that user into the database. So I'm going to say user equals new identity user. And we want to give this an ID. So we just create an ID for this. So we can say grid.newgrid.toString. Once we have the user, again, we can use the user manager. We call create async to create the user. And we just pass that the user we just newed up on the line above. And then we call _user manager dot add login async to add the login details. And into this, we pass the user we've just created and a new user login info. To the new user login info, we pass the provider details. So we pass provider user ID, and then for the display name, we just pass provider again. And that would be things like Google or Facebook or whatever we need. Again, we fix up our compiler errors. So subject ID becomes ID, username, we change the case, and then further down, subject ID becomes ID, and again, username, we change the case. And that's all the code done. So if I now run Identity Server, I run the API, and I run the MVC application. So if I go to an incognito tab and go to home/weather, remember our username is Alice, but the password is now pass123$. If I log in and say yes to permissions, then we hit the API, and the API returns back the data. But now we're using the database for our users and the database for all the other things that Identity Server needs. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to go and look at the code is on github.com at https://github.com/KevinRJones/Duende-IS-EF. Thank you.